In September 1980, one of the largest mechanized forces in the Middle East rolled across the Iranian border. Iraqi commanders expected a rapid, decisive conquest, but inside the tight, complex geometry of an urban environment, a decentralized militia of Iranian soldiers and civilians managed to grind that momentum to a halt. To understand this failure, we must look at the baseline conditions of 1979. Iran was in a period of profound internal upheaval. After months of nationwide protests and unrest, the monarchy of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi collapsed, and the Islamic Republic of Iran was established. That transition threw the state administration into disorder, but the immediate consequence for the Iranian military was severe. The new leadership executed massive purges across the armed forces. Senior officers from the former regime were arrested or entirely removed from command, completely disrupting the military's operational chain of command. Simultaneously, the late 1979 hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran severed Iran's remaining international alliances. The country was abruptly isolated from Western military support and spare parts, while the domestic economy plunged into crisis. By 1980, Iran appeared to the outside world as a militarily decapitated state. Leadership was preoccupied with internal disputes, its army was in turmoil, and its borders looked entirely undefended. It created a massive geopolitical vacuum. Across the border in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein calculated that post-revolutionary Iran was entirely vulnerable. He aimed to exploit this weakness, push Iraq's frontier deep into Iranian territory, seize the oil-rich Khuzestan province, and establish Iraq as the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. Achieving that required strict control over the local geography. Specifically, Iraq needed full control of the strategic Shatt al-Arab waterway and its two vital port cities, Abadan, home to a massive oil refinery, and Khorramshahr. Iraqi commanders operating under Saddam assumed the campaign would end quickly. They believed the purged Iranian forces would immediately fold under pressure. Reports indicate some Iraqi soldiers even packed white shirts in their gear, preparing for a victory parade rather than a sustained fight. On September 22, 1980, at dawn, they put the plan into motion. Following a massive artillery barrage along the 600-kilometer border, 6 full Iraqi divisions, supported by more than 500 tanks and armored vehicles, crossed the frontier. This was the standard military doctrine of the era, a massive armor-led blitzkrieg designed to crush opposition through speed and kinetic force. But that doctrine was designed for open desert plains, and they were about to hit very different terrain. This tactical map shows the Iraqi approach vectors toward Khorramshahr. Heavy armor relies on wide, solid ground, but the Khuzestan plains are cut by marshland and canals. Iraqi tanks repeatedly became bogged down in deep mud, bottlenecking along narrow, predictable routes. These environmental delays cost the Iraqi forces their most critical operational advantage: speed. The stalling armor gave the sparse Iranian defenders inside Khorramshahr crucial hours to reorganize their lines and call up civilian reinforcements. The terrain acted as the first layer of defense. The Iraqi advance proved that mechanized superiority is entirely dependent on favorable ground conditions. Inside the port city, the defending force was small and highly decentralized. It was a makeshift coalition of surviving army soldiers, Islamic Revolutionary Guard units, local police, and civilian volunteers. The technological mismatch was extreme. Against hundreds of heavy tanks, the Iranian defenders relied entirely on light infantry equipment, mostly rifles, RPG-7 launchers, and a few 106mm recoilless rifles. This 3D model shows defenders building urban kill zones. Debris in narrow streets forced tanks into predictable positions. Notice the sight lines. Snipers on rooftops and ground floor windows operated outside the tank gun's elevation angles. They could not aim high or low enough to return fire. The engagements in these tight corridors were violently destructive. The close-range use of recoilless rifles and heavy explosives inside structures caused buildings to collapse directly onto the tanks, burying crews beneath the rubble. In this environment, complex urban terrain acts as a force multiplier for decentralized infantry. It effectively neutralizes the kinetic power and range of traditional armored columns. Realizing their tanks were effectively useless inside the city limits, Baghdad commanders shifted to a pure war of attrition. Heavy artillery and Katyusha rocket batteries relentlessly pounded Khorramshahr, systematically leveling its infrastructure. Under the cover of this bombardment, Iraqi tactics changed. They deployed special forces and paratroopers to infiltrate the city at night in small groups, methodically seizing key administrative targets like the police headquarters and the railway station in the dark. The isolation of the Iranian defensive positions grew desperate. Ammunition ran dry. Volunteer fighters reported engaging in combat for nearly 48 hours without sleep. In the final block-by-block clashes among the shattered concrete, soldiers were reduced to fighting with bayonets and knives. The fighting eventually concentrated entirely on the bridge across the Karun River. If the bridge fell, the neighboring refinery city of Abadan would be cut off. To keep it open, young fighters from the Basij militia engaged in high-casualty suicide tactics, physically rushing advancing Iraqi tanks with explosives. Finally, on October 24, 1980, after 34 days of continuous urban combat, the defenders had no drinking water and no ammunition left. The order to withdraw was given. Survivors evacuated across the river, and the Iraqi flag was raised over the government building. Saddam Hussein technically captured the city, but the 34-day delay shattered his operational timeline. Those lost weeks gave Iran time to reinforce the rest of Khuzestan province, forcing the Iraqi army into a protracted war of attrition they hadn't planned for. The reality of the Iraqi occupation was immediately brutal. Iraqi units began looting the city. Contemporary reports documented assaults on women and the killing of residents who refused to leave. Khorramshahr, a once thriving port of 170,000 people, was reduced to burned-out buildings, wrecked armor, and piles of rubble. The ruins became the center of two opposing ideological campaigns. Iraqi officers painted, "We came to stay forever," on shattered walls, claiming the territory. Meanwhile, the Iranian government officially declared Khorramshahr a city of martyrdom. The Iranian leadership broadcast images of the devastated city across national television, weaponizing the trauma to rally young volunteers into the Basij militia. The slogan, "We will return," echoed relentlessly on state media. The brutal occupation backfired strategically. Instead of breaking morale, the destruction of Khorramshahr provided the newly formed Islamic Republic with its most powerful unifying symbol, to mobilize the country for total war. By April 1982, Iran launched Operation Beit ol-Qadas, a counteroffensive of 70,000 troops advancing on multiple axes. Rather than a frontal assault, engineers laid pontoon bridges over marshes to bypass front lines, maneuvering behind occupying forces and severing their supply routes. Cut off from communications and supplies, the isolated Iraqi garrison rapidly collapsed. After weeks of holding the surrounded city, organized resistance disintegrated. On May 24, 1982, the remaining Iraqi forces surrendered, and Iran reclaimed the city. This reversal forced the Iraqi army back to its own borders. It proved that a static urban defense, no matter how heavily occupied, eventually succumbs to a dynamic operational encirclement. The scale of the Iraqi defeat shocked Baghdad. Approximately 19,000 Iraqi soldiers, including senior officers, were taken prisoner. Images of these long columns of captives showed the total operational failure of the Iraqi invasion. But the cost paid by both sides was horrific. Tens of thousands of soldiers were dead or wounded. A vital economic hub was wiped off the map, leaving a ghost town that would require decades of reconstruction. The Battle of Khorramshahr remains a definitive historical warning. It demonstrates precisely how technological superiority and heavy armored might will always fracture against complex terrain and intractable human resistance. It was a profound tragedy for the people who lived there, but tactically, it laid down the brutal blueprint for modern asymmetric urban warfare in the Middle East.